Don't.
I needed you.
I need you. I need you too.
11 years. No greetings, no lovers, no grace. Kang Jae-min had survived gunshots and betrayal without breaking a sweat, but the graze of another person's skin could bring him to his knees in seconds. Until a Yoruba woman from Lagos broke every rule during a blackout, pressed her bare palm to his chest, and handed him the first stillness he had felt in over a decade. Once upon a time, tucked into the fog-draped hills of rural Vermont, there stood a compound that the underworld knew better than to whisper about. Not because it was secret, because the man inside it terrified them into silence. His name was Kang Jae-min. Most people called him the Iron Veil, the invisible emperor of the Cheongya Syndicate, because for 11 years, not one person had touched him and walked away unchanged. Not an ally, not a rival, not the women who tried, not even the men who swore loyalty with their lives. No handshakes, no embraces, no accidental brush of fingers across a sleeve. And those who got too close didn't always get the chance to explain themselves. Very few people knew the reason. They saw only the surface, a ruthless operator who had his enemies neutralized before they finished forming their plans. A billionaire who wore dark, seamless gloves in every season, in every room, at every hour. A man who lived alone inside walls of polished concrete and reinforced glass, surrounded by people who feared him too much to ask questions. But Kang Jae-min was not born this way. He was born in Incheon, South Korea, the younger son of a man who ran the Cheongya Syndicate with iron precision and quiet pride. Growing up, Jae-min was the one his father smiled at most. Sharp, curious, fast with numbers and faster with trust. He used to run through the family estate on rainy afternoons, chasing something, joy, maybe, or the particular feeling of being young and safe and loved. His father's hand on his shoulder felt like armor. He believed, back then, that blood meant something permanent. He was wrong. His older half-brother, Kang Tae-oh, returned from military school when Jae-min was 19. Tae-oh was older by 7 years and colder by a lifetime. There was something in the way he moved through a room, deliberate, assessing, that made the air feel slightly thinner. He smiled with his mouth and nothing else, and his eyes tracked Jae-min the way a predator tracks something it has already decided to take. Their father had always said the syndicate would belong to the son who earned it. Tae-oh decided earning was for people without options. It started quietly. Rumors placed in the right ears. A forged letter implying disloyalty. A staged misunderstanding that made Jae-min look careless in front of the elders. But Jae-min was his father's favorite, protected, trusted. So Tae-oh changed his approach. He stopped trying to break Jae-min from the outside and started from within.
Her name was Suwa.
She had a soft voice and patient eyes, and Jae-min, 22, idealistic, still believing that people revealed their truest selves when they loved you, fell completely. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. Dreams, doubts, the inner workings of a young man who wanted to lead with fairness in a world that rewarded cruelty. He didn't know Tae-oh had sent her. He didn't know every whispered confession was being recorded and handed to his enemy like gift-wrapped ammunition. The night it happened, Jae-min was 23. Suwa told him she had found something, proof that rival factions were moving against his father. She led him to an old processing warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon. The building smelled like rust and cold concrete, and the lights inside were not the warm kind. They were white and surgical and waiting. Tae-oh was waiting, too. They strapped him to a chair in the center of a white-walled room. Tae-oh stood in the doorway, calm, backlit, wearing the expression of a man who had been patient long enough. "Father always thought you were the better son," Tae-oh said. "Let's see what's left of you when I'm done." What followed was not an interrogation. It was not about information. It was deliberate, methodical destruction. Tae-oh had hired a rogue neuroscientist, a man who had spent years studying how pain, trauma, and empathy interacted inside the human nervous system. Together, they did not simply torture Jae-min. They rewired him. Repeated electroshock, applied to specific neural pathways over 48 hours, turned Jae-min's capacity for empathy into a weapon against himself. His mirror neurons, the part of the brain that allows humans to feel with each other, were overloaded and fused into his pain receptors. When the process was complete, physical contact with another person transmitted their emotional and physiological state directly into his body. Amplified. Unbuffered. A handshake felt like shards of glass driving under his fingernails. An embrace felt like drowning in someone else's grief. The guilt of one of his guards, the anger of a business associate, the low-grade anxiety of a passing staff member, all of it poured into him the moment skin met skin. The condition had a name: tactile empathic pain transference. Jae-min had another name for it. He called it the end of everything. Teo left him there for 3 days. When Jae-min's father finally found him, the damage was already permanent, neurological scarring that no specialist in any country had been able to reverse. Suwa was already gone. She had been paid and relocated before Jae-min was even untied from the chair. His father wept. Teo played the role of the shaken older brother, horrified, supportive, blameless. And Jae-min, unable to withstand the weight of another human presence, not even his father's, learned what it meant to be truly, permanently alone. He didn't collapse under it. He calcified. Over the next decade, Jae-min rebuilt himself into something formidable enough that no one could reach him without permission. He moved the syndicate's operations westward, into the United States, running everything through proxies and technology, and a reputation so precise in its brutality that most problems solved themselves before they reached him. He moved into the Vermont compound, a masterpiece of cold modernist design, glass walls and polished steel, and nothing that soft light could cling to. He wore gloves lined with medical-grade fabric. He kept a 3-foot perimeter enforced by staff who understood that violating it was not a career mistake. It was a final one. He was called a ghost, a machine, a monster. He let them say all of it. It was simpler than explaining that he was just a man living inside a body that had become a cage. Money couldn't quiet the noise. Power couldn't stop the phantom ache that flared even when no one touched him, the anticipatory dread of proximity, the way a crowded room felt like being burned alive from the inside. Every night, Jae-min sat in his glass tower and looked out at the mountains and wondered if this was the shape of the rest of his life. Until her, far from Vermont, in a city that never apologized for being loud, lived a woman named Adaeze Okonkwo. She had grown up in Surulere, Lagos, a neighborhood where the power cut out 3 times a week and people still found reasons to laugh. Her mother sold fabric from a stall in the market and worked evenings at a pharmacy. Her father had been a kind man until he wasn't, and then he was simply gone, vanished without ceremony when Adaeze was 10, leaving behind a silence her mother filled with work and her younger brother Emeka filled with noise. Adaeze learned early that fairness was not something the world distributed evenly. You could be angry about that, or you could be useful. She chose useful. By 15, she was helping her mother at the stall on weekends and tutoring neighborhood children on weekday evenings. By 17, she had organized a rotating fund among the market women so that no one vendor had to absorb a bad season alone. People in the neighborhood called her grounded, steady, the kind of person whose presence made a room feel manageable. When Emeka was in a motorcycle accident at 20 and lost partial use of his right arm, Adaeze made a decision without having to think about it. She would take care of him. Whatever that required, she would do it. The medical bills were not small. Emeka's rehabilitation was long. Her mother's health had been deteriorating for 2 years, and the pharmacy, where she worked, did not offer the kind of salary that covered specialist visits. Adaeze looked at the numbers and then looked at the options and understood that Lagos was not going to solve this for her. She found the listing on an international domestic work agency's site, buried between postings for estate managers in London and housekeepers in Dubai. A private residence in Vermont, United States. Live-in position. Exceptional compensation. Discretion required. No prior experience with high-profile households necessary, but the following was non-negotiable: comfort with isolation, precision, and silence. Everyone told her not to apply. Her aunt said the listing sounded like a trap. Her mother said the money seemed wrong. Her friend Ngozi said the man who owned the estate was rumored to be dangerous. Adaeze applied anyway. She had been around difficult situations her whole life. She knew how to make herself invisible when visibility was a risk. She needed the money. That was the beginning and end of the calculation. The day she arrived at the Vermont compound, the December air hit her like a wall of cold she had never prepared for, and the building itself stopped her breath for an entirely different reason. It was massive and silent, and somehow beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have never had to accommodate warmth. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking snow-heavy pines. Furniture that looked selected to impress rather than to sit in. Every surface clean enough to feel hostile. The house manager met her in the entrance foyer. Her name was Mrs. Park, 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled severely back, eyes that assessed and filed and moved on. You are here to clean, to maintain, and to be invisible. Mrs. Park's voice had the clipped efficiency of someone who had repeated these words many times. Mr. Kang does not tolerate disruption. You will not look him directly in the eye unless he initiates it. You will not remain in a room he enters. You will not ask questions about his schedule, his habits, or his personal life. You will answer when spoken to, briefly, and you will leave when dismissed. Adaeze nodded. And one more thing. Mrs. Park stepped slightly closer, her voice dropping without losing any of its precision. You will never, under any circumstances, touch him. The last staff member who made accidental contact left the compound in a medical vehicle. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am.
Good.
Mrs. Park turned toward the hallway, then paused. Welcome to the Kang estate, Miss Okonkwo. Do not make me regret recommending your application. Then Kang Jae-min walked in. He entered from the far corridor, and the shift in the room was immediate. Not dramatic, not announced, just the quiet physics of a powerful presence reorganizing the air around it. He was tall, lean, dressed entirely in black. His face was sharp-featured and still in the particular way of people who had trained themselves not to react. Dark eyes that saw things in the way a surgeon's hands work, efficiently, without sentimentality. His gloves were dark and seamless, fitted close to every knuckle. Adaeze dropped her gaze and fixed it on the polished floor, the way Mrs. Park had instructed. She stood still and waited. She felt him stop. She didn't hear a command or a dismissal. Just the weight of his attention, crossing the room and settling on her like something physical. 5 seconds.
10.
The silence in the compound deepened. Is she the new staff? His voice was quiet and deliberate, the kind of voice accustomed to being heard without being raised. Yes, Mr. Kang. Mrs. Park's answer was equally measured. More silence. Adaeze kept her eyes down, her breathing slow, her hands loose at her sides. She had survived market stalls with aggressive buyers and hospital waiting rooms with indifferent administrators. She could survive being stared at. Then she heard him take one step closer. Mrs. Park's posture shifted. She felt it in the air. Adaeze's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. Jae-min studied her. He had dismissed the last 3 hires in their first week. One for flinching when he entered a room, one for crying in the hallway where his security cameras caught it, one for the high-pitched nervous energy that radiated off her like a frequency he couldn't block out. He had been about to tell Mrs. Park not to bother replacing them, but this woman was different. She wasn't performing calm. She simply was calm. The stillness around her didn't feel like suppressed fear. It felt like water, deep, self-contained, indifferent to whether he approved of it or not. And the noise, the constant, grinding psychic noise that proximity to other humans generated in him, was quieter.
Not gone,
but quieter. He frowned without meaning to. She stays, he said. Mrs. Park blinked. Sir? I said she stays. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his footsteps even and unhurried, leaving Adaeze standing in the center of the cold foyer with her heart hammering against her ribs and no clear understanding of what had just happened. She had no idea she had just become the only person in 11 years who made Kang Jae-min feel something other than pain. She had no idea her life had just changed forever. The first week, Adaeze learned to move through the compound like a shadow with a mop. She was awake before 5 every morning, when the sky outside was the particular deep blue that existed between night and dawn. She cleaned in silence, tracing routines she had mapped in her first 2 days, which rooms Jae-min occupied and at what hours, which corridors his security rotations covered, which spaces were entirely hers to maintain without risk of crossing his path. She learned that he spent his mornings in the office at the north end of the second floor, that he ate alone and rarely at the table, preferring to work through meals, that every evening, without fail, he stood at the eastern window for exactly 40 minutes, not moving, not on his phone, just standing, staring at the tree line as though waiting for something that had not arrived yet. The other staff kept their distance from her. The cook, a quiet man named Mr. Huang, nodded at her in the morning and otherwise said nothing. The overnight security guard, a broad-shouldered man called Dae-young, treated her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been moved to an inconvenient location. She didn't mind. She had not come to Vermont for companionship. On the 8th day, she was dusting the library. It was a room she had not expected, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books in Korean, Japanese, English, French. Leather spines cracked at the edges. A reading chair with an indentation that suggested regular use. The room smelled like paper and cedar, and Adaeze had allowed herself to slow down in it, running her cloth along each shelf with more attention than the job technically required. She heard the door open behind her, and went completely still. According to the schedule Mrs. Park had given her, this wing wasn't Jae-min's until after 2 in the afternoon. It was barely 11. She didn't turn, didn't move, just held the cloth in her hand and waited, her eyes fixed on the spine of a thick Korean text she couldn't read. She heard his footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, move into the center of the room. And then they stopped. The silence stretched. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades, not threatening, just present. Unavoidable. Finally he spoke. "You don't flinch." Adaze's grip on the cloth tightened. "Sir, when I enter a room, people flinch. They always have." He wasn't complaining. His tone was that of a scientist noting data. "You don't." She didn't have a response for that. It wasn't a question, and whatever it was didn't seem to require one. So she said nothing. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing even, and waited for him to leave. He didn't. Another long pause, and then, so quietly she almost missed it. Interesting. The door closed. Adaeze exhaled, long and slow, pressing her free hand flat against the bookshelf to steady herself. Her palm felt the smooth cold of a leather-bound spine. She stood there for a full minute before her hands stopped trembling. She didn't understand what had just happened. He had come into a room that wasn't on a schedule, stood in silence for what felt like hours, said 2 words, and left. She didn't know what it meant, but something had shifted in the air of the compound, subtle, like the pressure change before rain, and she could feel it pressing against the inside of her chest. That night, she lay on her cot in the staff room on the 3rd floor and replayed the moment. The particular quality of the silence he had left behind. The way he had said interesting, not with condescension, not with cruelty, but with something that sounded almost like relief. She didn't sleep well. Over the following days, things changed without either of them naming the change. Jae-min stopped leaving rooms when she entered them. He would be at his desk when she came to clean, and he would simply glance at her once, acknowledging, not welcoming, and return to whatever he had been doing. She would clean around him with the precision of someone who had been doing this work for years, keeping to the 3-foot boundary Mrs. Park had outlined, never speaking unless addressed. But she noticed things. She noticed the way his breathing changed when she was nearby, slower, like a machine running at a more manageable speed. She noticed the way his jaw unclenched when she moved into his peripheral vision, as though some internal alarm had been set to a lower frequency. She noticed his hands most of all. The gloves, always present, black, smooth, perfectly fitted, coming off only when he thought no one was watching. He would flex his fingers after removing them, slowly, like a man trying to recall what his hands were for. One afternoon, she found a pair discarded on the arm of the sitting room sofa. She picked them up carefully, examining the fabric, medical-grade compression material, lined with something soft and insulated. Those were made in Seoul. His voice came from the doorway. Adaeze set them down immediately, lowering her head. "I apologize, sir. I was only..." I know what you were doing. He crossed the room and stopped at his customary distance. Up close, she could see the exhaustion scored into his face. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but the older, heavier kind that lives in a person's bones. You were curious. That's not a crime. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she stayed quiet. Do you know why I wear them? He asked. Mrs. Park had been very clear about asking personal questions, but he was the one offering. His voice had a strange quality to it, almost careful, like he was testing whether the words would break something on the way out. No, sir. Jae-min picked up the gloves and turned them over in his hands. Because touch is a transmission. Every person carries something, their guilt, their grief, their rage, and the moment their skin meets mine, I receive all of it, amplified, like a current that won't stop. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. 11 years ago, someone did something to my nervous system, made it so my ability to feel with others turned inward, became pain. A handshake feels like broken glass. A hand on my shoulder feels like being held underwater. He turned the gloves over once more. It's called tactile empathic pain transference. I call it something less clinical. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds like hell. It is. He looked at her. 11 years. She thought about Emeka, about the months after his accident when she couldn't hug him the way she used to because the angle of his arm had changed and he would flinch and she would feel the flinch land in her own chest. About what it would mean to lose that, not just the ability to touch, but the ability to receive comfort at all. To be sealed away from the basic exchange that made people feel real to one another.
I'm sorry, she said.
She meant it fully, without decoration. Something crossed his face, fast, unguarded, like a window left open by accident. Then it closed again. Don't, he said quietly. Pity is just another weight I can't carry. He left before she could find a reply. That night, the storm came. Adaeze saw it building from her window, the sky turning that sick, yellow-green shade that Lagos storms sometimes produced before they swallowed the afternoon whole. Here in Vermont, it looked even angrier. The wind picked up before midnight, throwing itself against the glass compound walls with a sound like something trying to get in. She heard Mrs. Park earlier that day in the kitchen, speaking to Mr. Huang in terse, careful sentences. One name surfaced through the closed door. Teo. Adaeze didn't know who that was, but the way Mrs. Park said it, the same way a person says the name of a doctor when the diagnosis is bad, told her enough. Later, Mrs. Park found her in the hallway. Mr. Kang's half-brother is arriving at the end of the month. When he is here, you do not exist. You stay out of sight, out of conversation, out of his line of vision entirely. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Park's voice dropped. Teo is a particular kind of dangerous, Miss Okonkwo. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that smiles while it dismantles you. Stay invisible. The warning settled in Adaeze's stomach like swallowed stone. The storm broke just after midnight. The thunder was the kind that didn't just sound, it pressed. The windows shuddered. The lights in the staff wing flickered twice and then surrendered entirely, dropping the compound into a darkness so complete Adaeze could feel it against her skin. She reached for her phone, used the light to navigate to her door. The hallway was black. The emergency lighting, on a circuit that had apparently not survived the night, was useless. Outside, something heavy and loose slammed against the side of the building. Branches, maybe, or something larger. She should stay in her room. That was the obvious, correct, sensible thing to do. Then she heard the sound. It came from below, from the second floor, a low, broken noise that didn't belong to the storm. Not the wind, not debris, not the settling of the building. A sound that was unmistakably human and unmistakably wrong. Adaeze moved, without making a decision about it. Her phone's light sliced through the dark as she went down the stairwell, her bare feet quiet on the marble. The sound grew as she moved toward the East Wing corridor, a broken, guttural thing, somewhere between a gasp and a scream that had given up on sound. She found him on the floor, Kang Jae-min was against the wall with his back to it, his body locked in rigid spasm, his gloves lying a few feet away from bare hands that clawed at the carpet, at his chest, at his own face. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. Blood ran from his nose in a thin, dark line. His skin had gone the color of old ash. Adaeze dropped to her knees. Mr. Kang. He didn't hear her. His whole body was seized, every muscle rigid, his breathing coming in thin, shallow cuts that sounded like a man trying to breathe through a fist. She had seen this before. Different cause, same terror. Emeka after his accident, before they understood what the brain damage had done to him, convulsing on a hospital floor while she screamed for a nurse. She knew what to do, and she did it before fear could talk her out of it. She grabbed his wrists. His skin was ice-cold and slick, and she pinned his hands flat to the floor, leaning her weight forward. "Listen to me," she said, low and clear. "You need to breathe. Find the breath. Right now." His eyes moved, found her face. For 1 second, recognition. And then his body convulsed again, harder, and he tried to pull away with the panicked strength of someone drowning. She didn't let go. She couldn't. He was going to crack his skull against the wall. He was going to choke. So she did the one thing Mrs. Park had told her, with absolute certainty, never to do. She pressed her bare palm against his forehead. The effect was instant and complete. Jae-min went still. Not unconscious, still. The kind of stillness that happens when something unbearable stops, suddenly and without warning, and the body doesn't yet know how to process the absence of pain. His eyes locked onto hers. Wide. Disbelieving. The convulsing stopped. The rigid clench of his muscles released. His breathing, which had been ragged and fractured, began, slowly, to find a rhythm. He stared at her like she was something he had seen before in a dream and could not reconcile with waking life. "Why?" His voice was barely sound. Scraped raw. "Why does it not burn?" Adaeze didn't understand the question. "What?" "Your touch." His eyes searched her face, wild, running over her features like a man reading something he had never expected to find. "It doesn't hurt." "It doesn't," he stopped. Swallowed. "It feels like nothing, like silence." She had no answer for that. She didn't move her hand. She stayed exactly where she was, kneeling beside him on the cold floor of a blacked-out corridor, while outside the storm tore itself apart against the walls of the compound. Slowly, carefully, Jae-min reached up and wrapped his bare fingers around her wrist. His grip was light at first, tentative, braced for something that didn't come. When the pain didn't arrive, she watched something change in his face. The bracing softened. The disbelief shifted into something more fragile, more dangerous. Something that looked, against all probability, like hope. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. The storm didn't care. It pressed against the compound walls the way storms always press, indifferent, relentless, while on the floor of a darkened corridor in Vermont, Kang Jae-min held onto a woman's wrist like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His breathing had steadied. The seizure had passed. But he did not let go. Adaeze didn't pull away. She kept her palm against his forehead and watched the tension drain out of him in slow, visible stages. First his shoulders, then his jaw, then the white-knuckle grip of his free hand against the carpet. The blood from his nose had slowed to a smear. The color was returning to his face, faint and gradual, like something warming from the inside. Finally he spoke. His voice was hoarse, scraped thin. "How is this possible?" She shook her head. "I don't know. You should hurt me." He looked at her with an expression she had no name for, raw and lost and completely unguarded in a way that made her feel like an intruder in something private. "Every person I touch, even the ones who mean well, their pain comes through. Their fear. Their rot. It transmits, direct and amplified, like I'm an open wound, and they're all salt." He lifted his free hand, the one that wasn't circling her wrist, and touched her cheek. His fingers trembled. "But you feel like silence." Adaeze didn't know how to hold those words. She let them sit between them in the dark. "Can you stand?" she asked softly. He nodded. But when he tried to move, his legs gave out beneath him, The seizure had taken everything, and she caught him before he could go down again. She shifted his arm over her shoulders and took his weight, and together they moved down the corridor in slow, careful steps, the emergency generator finally clicking to life somewhere below them, bathing the hallway in pale, humming light. She had never been inside his private quarters. The access card was in his pocket. He produced it without being asked, and she used it to open the door. The room was exactly what she had expected. Enormous and exact. A bed dressed in charcoal silk. Art on the walls chosen for value rather than feeling. Windows that turned the mountain view into something framed and contained. Everything immaculate in the particular way of spaces where life was happening very quietly and mostly in the dark. She helped him to the bed, and he sank into it, his head finding the pillow with the exhale of a man who had been holding himself upright through sheer force of will. His hand, still bare, still circling her wrist, did not release. "You should rest," she said. "I'll find Mrs. Park."
No.
His grip tightened.
Please.
"Don't leave." The word please in that voice, careful and unaccustomed, like a word he had rarely needed, stopped her completely. This was not the man who had dismissed staff with a look and kept the entire compound organized around his need for distance. This was just a man. A man who had been drowning alone for 11 years and had surfaced, briefly, into air, and could not bear to go back under. She sat on the edge of the bed. After a moment, he shifted, resting his head in her lap with the slow deliberateness of someone choosing to trust their own body for the first time in a very long time. She placed her hand lightly against his temple and felt his pulse, still irregular, but slowing. "Tell me something," he murmured. "Your voice. It helps." So she told him. She told him about Lagos, about Suralire and the market stalls and the way the rain smelled different there, like wet earth and petrol and something green, and living underneath everything. She told him about her mother, who could calculate the price per yard of any fabric before the seller finished quoting it, and who sang under her breath while she counted inventory. She told him about Emeka, about the accident, the hospital, the look on his face in the recovery ward when he realized that his right hand might never close into a full fist again, and the way he had laughed through it 3 days later because Emeka had always been built differently. She told him about the decision she had made to leave Lagos. About the stack of medical bills she kept in a folder under her bed back home, organized by due date, because organizing them made them feel more manageable even when they weren't. About the application she had almost not submitted because something about the listing felt like a test she hadn't studied for. Jae-min listened with his eyes closed, his breathing deep and even. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer the performative sympathy that rich people sometimes offered as a form of self-congratulation. He just listened, fully, the way people listen when what they are hearing matters to them. When she finished, he said, very quietly, "You are stronger than you know. I'm just doing what needs to be done." That is the definition of strength, not the absence of fear, not the performance of it, just continuing when stopping would be easier. She didn't have an answer for that. The storm had spent itself, leaving the compound in a wet, exhausted quiet. Outside, the trees dripped. Somewhere below, Mr. Huang was probably already assessing kitchen damage. The world was resetting itself, moving on. Jae-min's breathing had deepened into sleep, but his hand still rested at her knee, maintaining contact even in unconsciousness, his body reaching for what his waking mind had learned to fear. Adaeze knew she should leave. She knew every professional line she was sitting on. But she couldn't bring herself to break the contact that was, visibly, keeping him still. So she stayed. And sometime before dawn, her eyes closed too, her hand still resting at his temple, their breathing finding the same rhythm in the dark. Mrs. Park found them in the early light. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her expression doing something complicated and eventually landing on carefully neutral. "Mr. Kang will see you in his office," she said quietly. 10 o'clock. Adaeze slipped out without waking him. Her heart was already preparing for the exit interview. She dressed quickly, put her hair up, and appeared at the office door at exactly 10. Mrs. Park knocked twice and left without ceremony. Inside, Jae-min's voice. "Enter." He was seated behind a desk the size of a dining table, dressed in fresh black, gloves back on, his face reassembled into the precise, unreadable arrangement she recognized from her first day. There was no trace of the man on the floor of the corridor. There was no trace of the man who had asked her not to let go. She stood inside the door and waited for the dismissal. "Sit down." He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes moving over her face with the methodical attention she had come to recognize as his version of reading something closely. Then he said, "You saved my life." "I did what?" "Don't." His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't deflect." Anyone else in this house would have stepped back, called for help, followed the protocol I've spent 11 years enforcing. You broke every rule I have. He leaned forward slightly. "I need to understand why." Adaeze held his gaze. "Because you are going to hurt yourself." "That's not an explanation. That's an observation." "It's the only one I have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and came around the desk, stopping at his usual distance, close enough to read her expression, far enough that the 3-foot rule was technically maintained. Up close, she could see that the exhaustion was still there beneath the composed surface, and something else, a kind of alertness, sharp and forward-leaning, like a man who had just received unexpected news and was calculating what it meant. "I have not been able to tolerate human contact for 11 years, he said. "The condition is neurological. Permanent. Not a question of willpower or habituation. I have seen specialists on 3 continents who have confirmed this, without variation. And yet..." He paused, his jaw working slightly. "When you touched me last night, I felt nothing. No pain. No transmission. No noise." He said the word noise the way a man says the name of something that has been following him for a very long time. "Just quiet." Adaeze waited. "I don't know why it works with you," he continued. "I don't know if it will hold, or if the next time will be different. But I need to find out. Which means I need you near me." He met her eyes. "I'm offering you a different position. Not as part of the general household staff. As my personal attendant. You would accompany me to meetings, appointments, and any situation where proximity to others might be required. Your presence, even across a room, reduces the effect. I've noticed it every time you've been near me since you arrived." Adaeze's mind was doing several calculations at once. What if I refuse? Something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not a threat. Just certainty. "You won't." He was right, and they both knew it. Not only because of the salary. Mrs. Park had already mentioned, obliquely, that the new role paid 3 times the current arrangement, but because something in Adaeze's chest had recognized something in him, and walking away from it would feel like leaving a thing unfinished that shouldn't be. "When do I start?" she said. The tension in his shoulders released, so slightly she almost missed it. He reached into his desk drawer and placed a small silver key card on the desk between them. "Immediately. This gives you full access to every room in this compound, including here. There may be moments when I need you without advance notice. You'll need to be reachable." She picked up the card. It was cold against her palm. "Mrs. Park will brief you on the updated schedule." He turned back toward his desk, and just like that, the shadow of the Cheongya Syndicate was back, controlled, closed, operational. "That's all." She was almost at the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Okonkwo." She turned. He was looking at her from behind the desk, and for just a moment, the mask was off. Not completely, just enough to show the edges of something underneath. "Thank you," he said. The words came out slightly stiff, like something that had to be moved through unfamiliar channels to reach the surface. "For last night." She nodded once and left, closing the door softly behind her. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the hallway. She stood against the wall and pressed her palm flat to her sternum and waited for her heartbeat to find its pace again. It took longer than she expected. The weeks that followed rearranged the shape of her life at the compound so completely that it felt like a different building. She began attending Jae-min's operational meetings, sitting in a chair against the wall, silent, present, watching men who had probably ordered terrible things look sideways at her with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to grudging curiosity. She was in the room, and her being in the room changed something in him that was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The sharp lines of stress around his eyes softened. His tolerance for proximity, for the lieutenants and associates who needed to stand within 3 feet to conduct business, increased noticeably. He could sit through a 1-hour briefing without the muscle along his jaw going rigid with suppressed pain. He could shake a gloved hand without the particular flinch she had seen in footage from the security archives. She was, as he had said, his quiet. Touch between them evolved in increments so small that she could not have named exactly when each one started. His bare fingers brushed her hand when she passed him a document, her shoulder when she moved past the back of his chair. Always accidental seeming, always testing, always followed by a beat of held breath while they waited to see if the pain would arrive. It never did. One evening, late, after a meeting that had run 4 hours past its intended end and left the whole second floor smelling like cold coffee and suppressed violence, Adaeze found him at his desk with his head in his hands and his gloves off. He looked like a man being slowly taken apart from the inside. She crossed the office without deciding to. She stopped behind his chair, put her hands on his shoulders. He went completely still. She could feel the knots in his muscles, the places where 11 years of tension had calcified into something structural, and she worked at them slowly, her thumbs moving in careful circles along the ridge of his shoulder blades, up toward the base of his neck. A sound escaped him, low and raw and entirely unself-conscious. His head dropped forward. "Does this hurt?" she asked.
No.
The word came out rough. "It feels God." He exhaled. "It feels like being a person again." She kept going. She worked her way up to the back of his neck, feeling his breathing deepen, feeling his pulse slow beneath her fingertips. They stayed like that for a long time. No words, just the quiet of the office and the sound of her hands against the fabric of his shirt. Eventually, his hand came up and caught her wrist. He turned in his chair to look at her, and the expression on his face was the kind that people don't usually let other people see. "You should sleep," he said. The words were not what he wanted to say.
She could see that.
"Good night, Mr. Kang Jae-min." The word was quiet, almost reluctant, like a thing given away before he'd fully decided to give it. "When we're alone, you can call me Jae-min." Adaeze's breath caught. "Good night, Jae-min." She left before she had to watch what happened to his face after the door closed. In the hallway, she stood with her back against the wall, her palm pressed over her own heartbeat, trying to identify the thing building in her chest. She was in trouble, not the kind that came with consequences she could budget for. The days between that corridor and Tao's arrival were the strangest days of her life. She would be in the middle of a task, organizing briefing files, reviewing travel logistics for an upcoming meeting in Boston, sitting in the corner of a conference room while 3 men in suits argued about territory in voices that suggested they had been arguing about the same territory for years, and she would become aware, without looking, of exactly where he was in the room. Not through sound, not through the shift of other people's attention, through something she had apparently, without noticing, learned to read. She caught herself caring about things she had no professional reason to care about. Whether he had eaten, whether the tension she had seen in his jaw at noon had eased by evening, whether the call from Seoul that had left him standing at the eastern window for an hour after it ended had been about Tao or the elders, or something she had no access to yet. She told herself this was the natural result of sustained proximity, that she had been deployed as a kind of biological stabilizer for a man whose nervous system required careful management, and that management required attention, and that attention, held long enough, had a way of becoming something it was not supposed to be. She told herself this every morning for the better part of 2 weeks. It helped approximately as much as telling a river to stop moving. Tao arrived on a Friday morning. Adaeze was in the library organizing briefing files when she heard the cars on the gravel drive. She moved to the window and watched a convoy of black vehicles pull through the gate. The man who stepped out first, tall, sharply dressed, a smile arranged on his face with the precision of a prop, was not physically imposing. He didn't need to be. He had the particular quality of a person whose danger lived entirely in what he calculated rather than what he did. She was in the hallway when Jae-min descended the main stairs to meet him. She stayed in the shadow of the library doorway, watching. Tao spread his arms when he saw his brother. "Jae-min." You look better than the report suggested. His embrace was the kind that was really just hands on shoulders, proprietary brief, mapping distance rather than closing it. I wasn't expecting you, Jae-min said. His voice was level.
Careful.
I was in New York. The elders are asking questions about your health. I thought it was better to see for myself. Taeoa's eyes moved through the entrance hall with a slow sweep of someone inventorying an estate they expect to inherit. They landed on Adaeze. His smile didn't change, but something behind it did. And who is this? My personal attendant. Interesting. Taeo took a step toward her. I don't recall you keeping staff this close before. Things change. Jaemin's voice was still level, still careful. Indeed they do. Taeo circled slightly, not enough to be obviously predatory, but enough to be unmistakable to anyone paying attention. What's your name? Adaeze Okonkwo. Nigerian. He said it the way some people say a word they're deciding whether to value or dismiss. How interesting. And how long have you been here, Miss Okonkwo? Before she could answer, Taeo reached out, casual, almost conversational, as though to touch her shoulder. Jae-min moved faster than she had ever seen him move. His gloved hand caught Taeo's wrist in the air between them, stopping it cold. Don't. The single word was flat, final, and absolute. Taeo raised an eyebrow. His expression was curious in the way that predators are curious, entertained by resistance. Protective, are we? She is mine. Jae-min released his brother's wrist. You don't touch what is mine. There was a beat of silence. Taeo's smile returned, now carrying something sharper underneath it. Of course. Forgive me. He stepped back, smoothing his jacket. I wouldn't dream of overstepping. But as he walked away toward the guest wing, he looked over his shoulder at Adaeze, just once, just briefly, and the calculation in that look made her skin prickle. Mrs. Park had been right. The danger was not the kind that announced itself. That night, Jae-min summoned her to his private quarters. She found him standing at the eastern window, bare hands pressed flat against the cold glass, staring at the mountain dark. He knows, Jae-min said, without turning around. The way I moved when he reached for you. The fact that I keep you close. He knows you're different to me. Is that a problem? Taeo collects leverage the way other people collect art. He finally turned, and the exhaustion in his face was staggering. He will use you to dismantle me if he can find a way. I should send you somewhere he can't reach. But you won't. No. His voice was rough. I can't. He stopped. Started again. I need you here. She crossed the room and stood close, not touching, just close. Then we handled Taeo together. He reached up, bare fingers cradling her face, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone with the careful attention of a man who has learned to treat fragile things as though they might be the last fragile thing. You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me.
So he did.
He told her about the White Room in Incheon, about Suwa and the 48 hours that followed, about the neuroscientist and the electrodes and the version of himself that had walked out of that building permanently altered, about a decade of silence, of building walls so high that even the people who worked for him had never once managed to put a hand on his shoulder without consequence. When he finished, Adaeze took his face in both her hands. He didn't make you into something lesser, she said. He made you into someone who survived what would have ended most people. That's not damage. That's iron. Jae-min's eyes closed. She felt him lean into her palms, the whole weight of it, the way a person leans into something when they have been standing alone for a very long time. You make me want to believe that. Then believe it. He opened his eyes. Something in them had shifted, deeper, darker, more present. He was looking at her with the full force of a man who had learned not to look directly at things that mattered to him because they always got taken away. Adaeze.
His voice had changed.
Tell me to stop. Stop what?
This.
His free hand moved to the line of her jaw, tilting her face up, and his eyes asked the question his mouth was still forming. Because if I don't stop now, I won't be able to. Every reasonable thought she had tried to give, every breath inside her head raised its hand. He was her employer. This was his compound and his world and his war, and she was a woman from Suralere who had come here to clean his floors and save her brother's medical bills, not to fall into the orbit of a syndicate leader with 11 years of controlled grief and hands that finally, impossibly, didn't hurt when they touched her. She looked at him, not at the shadow, not at the iron veil of the Cheongya, just at the man, standing in his own bedroom at midnight, holding her face like she was the only real thing in it.
"Don't stop," she said.
He closed the distance between them with a gentleness that surprised her, his lips meeting hers carefully, the way you approach something you have wanted for a long time and do not want to break. One hand stayed at her face. The other found the curve of her waist, pulling her in without urgency, without demand, as though what mattered was not the arrival but the fact of it. Adeeze's eyes closed. She had been kissed before. Not like this. Not with the weight of 11 years behind it. Not with that particular mixture of reverence and hunger that made her feel simultaneously held and seen. She kissed him back and felt something in her chest open like a window that had been painted shut. When they finally came apart, both of them were breathing differently. He rested his forehead against hers. "This is insane," he murmured. "I know. I could destroy you just by keeping you close to me." "You could." She didn't move back. "And I'm still here." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands moving through her hair, and the world narrowed itself down to the simple, staggering fact of human contact freely given. 3 floors below, in the East Wing guest suite, Teo stood at his window with a phone to his ear. "I need everything on an Adaeze Okonkwo. Lagos, Nigeria. Current position, personal attendant to Kang Jae-min. Family, finances, medical history, anyone she would do anything to protect." He listened. "Also, there is a neurotoxin I need. Something that presents as cardiac in the blood work. Clean, tasteless, dissolvable." Another pause.
"Yes.
"I want to hear before the week is out." He ended the call and looked at his reflection in the dark window. The anchor had been located. All that remained was cutting the line. Jaemin woke before dawn, as he always did. The room was still dark, and Adeeze was still asleep beside him, her breathing quiet and even, one hand curled loosely near her face. He gave himself 5 minutes just to look at her. The particular stillness of a person in deep, unguarded sleep, the rise and fall of her chest, the way the faint early light from the window found the planes of her face. In 11 years, he had not woken next to another person. He had forgotten what it felt like to have a human life happening alongside yours in the dark. 5 minutes. Then he dressed in silence and went to his office to handle the morning reports. The water was on his desk as always, filtered, chilled, in a crystal glass. He was halfway through his overnight communications from Seoul before he drank it, barely tasting it, his mind already moving through the agenda for the day. The first sensation arrived 20 minutes later. A tightness in his chest, sharp and wrong in a way that was distinct from his condition. Not the familiar psychic noise of proximity, but something physical. A burn moving through his veins with a speed and precision that told him, immediately, what it was.
Poison.
He tried to stand. His legs folded. He caught the edge of the desk, his vision already blurring at the margins, his chest compressing like something was sitting on it. Blood came up into his mouth, dark, wrong, and he hit the panic button beneath the desk before his knees met the floor. His guards found him 30 seconds later. The estate physician arrived in 4 minutes. Mrs. Park was already initiating lockdown protocol before the 2nd minute. The vial was found 8 minutes after that. His head of security, a man named Sergeant Bach, who had the face of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered, came to the edge of the room and held it up in a gloved hand. A small glass vial.
Clear liquid.
"We found this in Miss Okonkwo's apron, sir. The one hanging in the staff room. She's the only staff member with access to your private water supply." The words entered Jaemin's consciousness through a filter of antidote and pain and the physician's instructions to stay still. He stared at the vial. The pain in his chest was already subsiding, the antidote was working, but a different pain was growing, expanding upward from some place below reasoning, some place that had been broken before and remembered exactly what it felt like. He thought of Suwa, of the way she had kissed him the morning before the warehouse, of the way she had looked at him when she said she loved him, with an expression he had believed completely because he had wanted to believe it. Adaeze had looked at him the same way. He tried to separate the thought from the panic, tried to apply the same precision he applied to everything. She had no documented connection to rival factions. The background check had come back clean. There was no obvious motive. But she was the only one with access. And the vial had been in her apron. And everyone who had ever gotten close to him had ultimately been a weapon held by someone else. His condition came rushing back in the absence of her, the ghost pain flooding every nerve like static, amplified by the emotional weight of betrayal, real or suspected. The physician's hands on his arm felt like knives. The sound of voices in the room felt like glass dragged across stone. He said it before he could stop himself. "Bring her here." They brought Adaeze in 10 minutes later. Her hair was still loose from sleep. Her face, when she came through the door, was full of a fear that looked completely real, eyes wide, hand rising toward him before one of the guards intercepted it. "What happened? They said you were poisoned. Are you? Did you do it?" The question came out flat, emptied of everything.
She stopped.
The fear in her face changed shape.
What?
Sergeant Bach held up the vial. "This was found in the pocket of your apron. I have never seen that in my life. You have access to his private water supply." "I bring him water in the mornings, yes. I didn't put anything in it." "Jae-min." She said his name, and something in the flatness of his expression must have told her that the name was not landing the way it used to.
"Please.
Look at me. I would never do this." That's what she said. The words came out of him before he could evaluate them. "The last woman I trusted. Right before she handed me to the men who destroyed my nervous system." He heard himself, heard how hollow it sounded, and kept going anyway because the pain was enormous and the fear was older than any logic he could apply to it. She said the same words in the same voice. "I am not her." Adaeze's eyes were wet now, but her voice was steady. "I don't know who hurt you, and I understand why you're afraid. But I love you, and I am telling you the truth." The word love landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in every direction at once. He turned his face away. "Take her to the secured room on the basement level," he said quietly. "Post guards. No one enters without my authorization." The sound that came out of her then was not a scream. It was worse than a scream. It was the sound of a person understanding that something irreversible had just happened. "Jae-min, it's Teo. It has to be Teo. You have to think about this. He was here. He has people here. The guards were already moving, and Jae-min kept his face turned toward the window so he did not have to see her being taken out of the room. He listened to her voice down the corridor, still clear, still trying to reach him, until a door closed and the compound went quiet. He stood at the window for a long time after that. Outside, the mountains were still and indifferent. Below, somewhere in the basement, Adaeze was in a room with acoustic-treated walls and no daylight. Without her, his condition was a wildfire again. Every sound scraped. Every presence in the building registered a sensation, distant and muffled by the walls between them but present, grinding, exhausting. The physician had left. The guards had rotated. He was alone in a way that felt nothing like the silence she gave him, nothing like quiet, just absence, vast and heavy and cold. A small voice in his chest had been speaking since the moment he gave the order, and it said the same thing on a loop, quiet and merciless. "You have made a terrible mistake." 3 days passed. He read the reports Mrs. Park left outside his door and absorbed nothing. The Cheongya Syndicate's Eastern alliances were restless. The elders were convening. Teo had made himself visible at 3 syndicate functions in 2 days, giving interviews, answering questions about his brother's health with the careful, measured concern of a man who had rehearsed the role of the worried successor for a very long time. On the 3rd night, Teo knocked once and let himself into Jae-min's quarters without waiting. "Brother." His voice carried the right notes of concern, tuned precisely. "I heard about the girl. A terrible thing. I'm sorry you've been through this again. Get out." "I only wanted to."
"Get out."
Teo lingered a half-second too long before moving toward the door, and in that half-second, Jae-min caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The angle was slight, the light was low, but the expression was there. The ghost of a satisfied smile, gone before it was fully formed. It was enough. Jae-min stood at the window long after the door closed, his mind moving with the particular cold precision that had built an empire in 11 years. He ran it back from the beginning. The vial in the apron, the timing of the discovery, the clean background check that had returned no financial anomalies and no connections to rival networks, the fact that Teo had arrived the week before the poisoning, that Teo had a known habit of installing informants in the households of anyone he intended to move against. And one more thing, the thing Jae-min had been avoiding because looking at it directly required admitting what he had done. When Adaeze had told him she was innocent, the conviction in her voice had not been the conviction of a prepared liar. It had been the conviction of someone who was watching the only person they had trusted with something true refuse to believe them. He had seen that before. He had felt it once from the other side of it in a white room in Incheon. He called Sergeant Bach. I am going to see her. Alone. No guards outside the door. And I want the corridor camera on the basement level switched to manual hold for 30 minutes. Sergeant Bach started to say something. That wasn't a conversation, Jae-min said. The basement was 3 locked doors below ground level. Jae-min descended the stairwell alone, his footsteps echoing off concrete in a way that reminded him of other places he preferred not to think about. He used his master key for each lock. He opened the final door. The room was exactly what its name implied, walls lined with acoustic foam, one overhead light, no windows, a cot against the far wall. Adaeze was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked like someone who had been crying for 3 days and had stopped not because it was over, but because she had run out. Her wrists were raw. There were circles under her eyes that hadn't been there before. When she saw him, she didn't stand.
She didn't speak.
She just looked at him with eyes that had gone very quiet, the way eyes go quiet when hope has been methodically extinguished. Jae-min crossed the room and went down to one knee in front of her. He did not know how to begin, so he began with the only true thing. I'm sorry. She looked at him. Nothing moved in her face. I let my history think for me, he said. I let fear make me cruel to you. And I was wrong. He reached for her hand, and she pulled it back. The rejection moved through him like a physical thing, worse than any pain his condition had ever delivered. He sat with it. He had earned it. I know who did this. Teo placed the vial. His operative had access to the staff room. The evidence was constructed.
He paused.
You told me that from the beginning. I did. Her voice was hoarse. You did. And I chose not to hear it. He met her eyes. I don't know how to repair what I've done to you. I don't know if it's reparable. But I need you to know that I believe you. And I need to ask you something that I have no right to ask. She waited. Teo is watching the compound. He has cameras on every external angle. He believes you are guilty. He believes he's won. Jae-min's jaw tightened. I need him to keep believing that. Which means I need to take you out of here in a way that looks permanent and keep you somewhere safe while I end this. Something shifted in her expression. And then what? She said. Then you come back. And we do this properly. But if Teo finds out you're alive before I've neutralized him, he will use you to destroy me. He'll hurt you to get to me. His voice dropped. I cannot let that happen. Adaeze looked at him for a long time. The room was very quiet. Then slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone making a choice rather than a reflex, she reached out and placed her palm against his face. The silence rushed back in, immediate, total, like water filling a space that had been hollow. He felt his eyes close. He felt his nervous system settle like a building that had been shaking in a storm and suddenly, inexplicably, found its foundation. I need you to trust me, she said quietly.
Not only about this.
About everything.
Can you do that?
Yes. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. I swear it. Then get me out of here. He pulled her close, wrapping both arms around her, his face against the side of her head. He could feel her hesitate before her arms came around him in return, slowly, like something being decided in stages. He held on anyway. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I should have said it before I needed to. I should have believed you before I needed proof. But I love you, and I am done being ruled by the things that were done to me." Her grip tightened. "I love you too," she said. "Even when you're catastrophically wrong." He laughed, short, startled, unfamiliar, and pulled back just enough to look at her face. "What happens next is going to require you to trust people you don't know yet. To stay out of sight. To be invisible in a way you've never had to be before." "I've spent my whole life being invisible," she said. "I'm very good at it." "When this is over," he said, "I want him to know. I want Teo to see exactly what brought him down." Adaeze met his eyes. "That's what I was going to ask for." He kissed her forehead. Then he stepped back and his face changed, the mask sliding back into place, cold, controlled, the iron veil assembled from the outside in. "Scream," he said quietly. "Make it real. Make it carry." She opened her mouth and screamed, and the sound that came out of her was the sound of pure animal terror, full-throated and genuine, because she was performing it and she was also feeling it, and great performers always find the truth in the center of the lie. Jae-min closed his hand gently around her throat, no pressure, his thumb positioned for the camera angle in the corridor outside, not for damage, and she clawed at his hands with the instinctive panic of a body that did not fully trust what the mind was telling it. "You deceived me," he said, loud enough to carry through concrete. "You betrayed my trust. And now it is finished." He drew the gun from his holster, pressed the muzzle to the side of her head, and Adaeze let herself go limp against him, her body going completely slack, trusting his hands to catch her. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet went into the acoustic foam 2 inches from her ear, close enough that the heat from the muzzle flash crossed her cheek, and she collapsed in his arms with the perfect stillness of someone who had let go of everything. He lowered her to the floor, checked her pulse, strong, steady, and stood. When he opened the door, Sergeant Bach and his most loyal guard, a veteran named Woo Jin who had served Jae-min's father for 2 decades, were waiting outside. The other guard, Teo's man, Jae-min had known since Tuesday, was watching from the corridor. "It's done," Jae-min said flatly. "Woo Jin, take care of it quietly. No record." Woo Jin bowed. The understanding in his eyes was complete. He entered the room, wrapped Adaeze in black canvas with careful, practiced hands, and lifted her. She was entirely still, her breathing almost imperceptible. "Perfect." Teo's man was still watching. Jae-min didn't look at him. He leaned against the wall, his face a mask of cold, controlled finality, and stayed there while Woo Jin carried her past and through the door and up the concrete stairwell. When the sound of footsteps faded, Jae-min stood alone in the corridor for a long moment. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the wall and breathed until they stopped. The first part of the plan was done. The hard part was everything that came next. 3 floors above, in the East Wing, Teo watched the external feed on a tablet. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. He watched Woo Jin load a body bag into an unmarked transit van in the compound service bay. He exhaled through his nose. He lifted his glass of whiskey in a small, private toast to his own reflection in the dark window. He didn't notice that Woo Jin had not looked at the camera once. That a man who had served 2 generations of the Kang family would have looked up, would have registered the surveillance as a matter of habit, unless he had already been told exactly where to aim his eyes. Teo had won. He was certain of it. He was wrong. And the clock on how long that certainty would hold was already running. The safe house was a square concrete building in the foothills, 40 minutes from the compound on unpaved road. 1 room, 1 window with security bars, a cot, a small television, 2 weeks of canned food, a burner phone with 1 number, and Woo Jin's apology on the way out the door. "Stay here," he said. "Don't contact anyone unless something changes. He'll come for you when it's done." Adaeze spent the first 2 nights pacing. 23 steps from wall to wall. She counted without meaning to. She thought about Emeka, about the hospital folder organized by due date. She thought about the moment in the basement when Jaemin's face had been that close and she had made the choice to trust him again despite the 3 days of raw grief that had told her not to. She thought about what it meant to love someone who was capable of believing, even briefly, the worst possible thing about you. She also thought about what it meant that when he realized he was wrong, he had not fortified himself behind the position. He had come down 3 flights of stairs alone in the middle of the night and gone to his knees. On the 7th day, she started watching the news. Teo was everywhere, giving statements, attending syndicate functions, positioning himself with the steady, practiced confidence of a man whose succession plan had been rehearsed for decades. "My brother is grieving," he told a reporter outside a Seoul conference venue, his face perfectly calibrated to concern. "The betrayal he experienced has taken a severe toll. But the Cheongya will endure. I will make sure of it." Adaeze threw the remote at the wall. It bounced off and landed on the floor, and she looked at it for a long moment and then picked it up and kept watching, because anger was more useful than despair, and despair was the only alternative. On the 10th day, she found a photo. It was grainy, taken from a distance, uploaded by a news account that covered syndicate activity, and it showed Jae-min being helped into a car by 2 guards outside the compound's main gate. His body was hunched. His face, even at that resolution, was gray. He moved like a man who had forgotten how to want to arrive wherever he was going. She stared at the image for a long time. Then she picked up the burner phone and dialed. Woojin answered on the 2nd ring. "What's wrong?" "He's dying. Not from the poison. From the absence of." She stopped. Steadied herself. "I need to come back." "That is absolutely not possible. Teo has surveillance on every. There's a gala." She had seen it on the news that morning. Teo was hosting an event at the compound, a formal gathering of syndicate leadership, framed as a night of renewal. Masked, black tie, staff from 3 catering agencies. "I've spent my entire adult life being invisible in rooms full of people who don't see me. Get me into that room, Woojin." A long silence. "You understand that if anything goes wrong, the consequences are permanent." "I understand." Her voice was steady. "He needs his silence, and I am the only one who can give it to him. So get me into that room." Another silence. Then a slow exhale. "I'll call you back in an hour." He called back in 40 minutes with a plan, a garment bag arriving the next morning, and an expression on his face when he delivered it that suggested he had done something he hoped he would not regret. The uniform was a sleek black server's jacket and a gold masquerade mask that covered from forehead to cheekbone. When Adaeze looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Good. That was precisely the point. The compound on the night of the gala looked like a fever dream someone had designed to impress people who were already very difficult to impress. Black silk hung from the ceilings of the entrance hall like storm clouds held in suspension. Gold chandeliers poured light in warm, honeyed angles. Every surface held candles, dozens in each room, hundreds across the floor, casting shadows that moved like living things. The whole building smelled like expensive perfume and something colder underneath it, a particular scent that Adaeze had learned to associate with power and danger, and the particular kind of violence that wore a tuxedo. She moved through the service entrance with the catering staff, head down, tray in hand, every gesture efficient and unhurried. No one looked at her twice. No one looked at any of them twice. That was the point of catering uniforms. That was the whole design. The main ballroom was filling fast. Men in suits that cost more than small vehicles. Women in gowns accessorized with masks that covered enough of their faces to grant permission to be watched. String music from a quartet in the corner. The low, constant murmur of strategic conversations conducted at a volume that required leaning in. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, Teo held court. He wore a simple black mask that somehow made his face look more like itself, calculating, satisfied, sovereign in a way that was only possible when you believed no one was left to challenge you. Beside him, in a chair that was technically a seat and functionally a cage, sat Jae-min. Adaeze's breath left her body. He was dressed in black, his silver mask in place, but even from across the room the wrongness of him was visible. He sat too still, the way a person sits when movement costs them. His gloved hands gripped the arms of the chair with the steady, white-knuckled pressure of a man holding himself together by force. There was no life in his posture. No presence, no dominance, just the hollow remnant of someone being kept upright by the expectation of others. She had done this to him. By being taken away, she had done this. She picked up a tray of champagne and began moving through the room. She caught pieces of conversations as she passed through clusters of guests. Heard his name used in the past tense. Heard Teoa's name used with the careful, proprietary familiarity of people who were already adjusting to a new order. She kept her head down and her expression neutral and worked her way, slowly and without urgency, toward the platform. It took 40 minutes to close the distance without triggering a second glance. When she was 5 feet from the platform, she put down her tray, slipped a small card from inside her jacket, 7 words in her handwriting on white stock, and stepped forward. She reached for his hand. The moment her fingers touched the back of his glove, Kang Jae-min's entire body went rigid. His head turned. His eyes, visible above the mask, below the brow, the only part of his face she could see, went wide with a shock of recognition, of disbelief, of something desperate trying to calibrate itself against what it was seeing. She pressed the card into his palm. Their eyes held for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped back into the crowd and was invisible again. Behind her, she heard the sound of a chair moving. Heard Teoa's voice, quick with concern that wasn't concern. "Brother, are you unwell?"
No.
Jaemin's voice, when it came, was different. It was full.
Alive.
Present in the room in a way it had not been when she had walked in. "I'm fine. Better than fine." Adaeze moved to a station near the wall and did not look back. But she felt his eyes moving through the crowd, scanning, searching, and she allowed herself one breath of something close to relief. The Viper was awake. For the next hour, she watched him from the periphery as she worked. He moved through the room with a recovered energy that was visible even to the guests, shaking gloved hands, speaking with lieutenants, occupying space in the particular way that reminded everyone in it why they had once feared him and forgotten it only because he had let them. She watched Teoa's expression calibrate and recalibrate, his satisfied certainty developing hairline fractures that he was trying to seal before anyone else noticed them. At midnight, Teo called for attention. The music stopped. The crowd gathered. He stepped to the center of the platform with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Tonight," he said, "we mark a transition. A difficult period, handled with the resilience that defines this family. My brother has asked me to assume primary operational leadership, effective immediately, while he attends to his recovery. I am honored to serve the Cheongya in this capacity, and I want to assure each of you."
No.
The word came from Jae-min, and it cut through the room with the same quality a blade has when it passes through something cleanly, quick, total, final. He stood. The silver mask came off. His face was pale and marked by the past 2 weeks, but his eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "I appreciate the concern," he said, his voice carrying to every corner without effort. "But I am not stepping aside.
Not now.
Not ever." He looked at Teo. Not with anger, with something colder, more precise. "I know what you did. The poison. The vial. The informant you placed in my household before you arrived. I have documentation on all of it, and the elders will see it before morning." He paused. "I am giving you one opportunity to walk out of this room without assistance. That opportunity will not be offered twice." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Teoa's smile stayed in place. "It was a remarkable performance. You're not well. Everyone here can see. They can see a man who is done performing weakness for your benefit." Jae-min looked out at the room, and whatever the guests saw in his face made several of them look away. "Anyone who has been compensated by my brother to support this transition should consider very carefully whether that compensation covers what comes next." The temperature of the room dropped 3 degrees. Teoa's mask finally cracked. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small remote control and pressed the button before anyone could move. The sound began as a sub-frequency hum, barely perceptible, and then in the space of 4 seconds, it rose into a high-pitched, bone-penetrating shriek that tore through the ballroom like something physical. Champagne glasses vibrated off tables. The chandeliers swayed. Guests dropped where they stood, hands clamped to their ears, bodies folding in on themselves. And Jae-min fell. He went down hard, his body seizing immediately, blood already at his lip, his hands clawing at the sides of his head. Adaeze was already moving. She dropped the tray. She was across the room before she had finished deciding to move, dodging a guard who reached for her. Her elbow caught him in the throat, and he went sideways, and she hit her knees on the platform beside Jae-min with enough force to bruise, grabbing his face with both hands. "Look at me," she said, cutting through the shriek with every decibel of clarity she had. "Jae-min, eyes on me, right now." His eyes found her. The seizure was still moving through him, his body locked and shaking, and then her hands were on his face, and it began to ease. Not because the sound had stopped, because she was there, and her presence did what it had always done. It filtered.
It dampened.
It gave his nervous system somewhere to go that wasn't the inside of its own amplified feedback loop. His lips moved. She read them more than heard them. Run. Absolutely not. She pulled him against her and wrapped her entire body around his, pressing her palms flat over his ears, using herself as a physical buffer between him and the sound. She felt the frequency passing through her. The ache of it was significant, but it was bearable. Pain had always been bearable to her. That was simply the shape of her nervous system. His seizure continued to subside. He looked up at her from inside the circle of her arms, his expression moving through disbelief and into something that had no clean name. Tao's voice cut through the chaos from the platform, still holding the remote, the earplugs in his ears making him the only person in the room who was not suffering. "She's dead," he said, staring at her. "I watched. You watched what I needed you to watch." Jaemin's voice was steady now. He rose with Adaeze's help, one arm staying around her.
Standing. Upright.
Present. "You have always underestimated me, Tao. You definitely underestimated her." Tao's hand moved toward his holster. Adaeze was faster. The knife she had tucked inside the catering jacket, a habit from a neighborhood where knowing how to fight dirty was a practical skill, not a personality trait, left her hand before Tao's fingers reached the gun. It buried itself in his shoulder with a sound that was lost in the general chaos, and he stumbled back with a sharp, outraged noise. Jae-min crossed the platform in 3 strides, took the remote from Tao's failing grip, and crushed it under his heel. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was staggering in its completeness. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath simultaneously, as though exhaling might restart whatever had just happened. Jae-min stood over his half-brother, blood on his face, his chest moving hard. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "You failed the first time, in Incheon. You fail again tonight. The difference is, there won't be a third attempt." Tao, clutching his shoulder, his careful performance finally fully broken, looked at Adaeze with something between fury and genuine incomprehension. "She was supposed to be dead." "She's harder to kill than you planned for," Jae-min said. He turned his head. Woojin and 6 additional guards came through the main doors at a pace that suggested they had been outside them for some time. They surrounded the platform with weapons drawn, and Tao, bleeding, exposed, and out of moves, let himself be taken without the dignity of continued resistance. The doors closed behind him. His voice, cursing and threatening in diminishing stages, faded with his footsteps down the corridor. The ballroom was very quiet. Jae-min turned to Adaeze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was full of people, all of them watching, and neither of them cared. He pulled her in, his arms wrapping around her with a force that was entirely different from the controlled, careful contact of the past weeks. This was grip. This was need. This was a man who had spent 11 days believing he had put a bullet in the only person who had ever given him silence. "I thought I'd killed you," he said into her hair, his voice stripped of everything except that. "Every night. I thought." "I know." Her arms were around him just as tightly. "I know. I'm here." He pulled back to look at her. His hands framed her face, his thumbs moving over her cheekbones. The sound. It should have been incapacitating. You didn't even slow down. She held his gaze. This was the moment. The thing she had carried her whole life. The explanation for the reason the doctor's office always looked at her twice. The reason she had never needed painkillers for anything and had learned, early, that this was not normal. I have SIPA, she said. Congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. My nervous system doesn't process physical pain. It never has. He stared at her. She watched him put it together, not slowly because he was not a slow man, the pieces falling into alignment with a speed that was almost audible. That's why. His voice was barely above a breath. You don't carry pain in your nervous system. When I touch you, there's nothing to transmit. No suffering. No static. Just silence, she said. Perfect opposites. He said it with wonder, the kind of wonder that doesn't arrive often and stays. You feel nothing. I feel everything. Together. We balance. He kissed her. In the middle of the ballroom, in front of what remained of the syndicate's formal leadership and the ghosts of the evening's chaos, he kissed her like she was something he had been trying to find for 11 years without knowing what he was looking for. When they broke apart, someone in the room began to clap. Slowly at first, then others and others, until the sound of it filled the space where the sonic weapon had been. Adaeze pressed her forehead against his and smiled. Don't get comfortable, she said quietly. We still have a council to face. I know. He kept his hands at her face. Stand with me? She looked at him. At the man who had locked her in a basement and gone to his knees to apologize for it. At the man who had built walls 11 years thick and let her walk through them without asking her to be careful. At the man who had needed her silence and somewhere along the way had started to feel like hers. Always, she said. The elders of the Cheongya Syndicate did not do anything quickly, and they did not do anything warmly. They convened in the estate's formal council room. Dark wood, dark intentions, 12 faces that had been hardened by decades of decisions that would not survive sunlight, and they waited for Kang Jae-min to come to them. He made them wait 11 minutes past the appointed time. When he walked in, Adaeze was beside him. He had changed into a fresh suit. He had not cleaned the blood from his face. Let them see it. Let them understand exactly what had been done in this compound while they were busy managing their politics and their succession concerns and their quiet enthusiasm for Taoa's reliability. Adaeze wore the green silk dress from the first dinner they had shared, his request specific and deliberate. Let them see exactly who you are to me. No more positioning. No more explaining. She had not argued. The elders looked at her the way people look at a variable they had not anticipated and were not certain they wanted to incorporate. The woman at the head of the table spoke first. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that patience was a form of power. Her name was Elder Ha, and Jae-min had told Adaeze she was the most important voice in the room. Not the loudest, not the most senior in years, but the most trusted. CEO Kang, Elder Ha said, you have brought chaos into this family. A poisoning. A confrontation in front of half our leadership. And now you present us with a woman who, until 3 weeks ago, was cleaning floors in your East Wing. She let that land. Your brother claims you have been compromised by grief. That you lost perspective after the betrayal of a staff member you had grown too attached to. My brother's a liar, Jae-min said. Not loudly. Just with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact he is verified from every possible angle. He poisoned me. He manufactured the evidence against her. He embedded an operative in my household before he arrived for the specific purpose of creating that evidence. And tonight, he deployed a sonic weapon on the syndicate's own leadership because I refused to step aside. He looked around the table. I have documentation for all of it. Wu Jin entered with a laptop. The security footage played without narration needed, Taoa's operative sliding the vial into Adaeze's apron in the staff room while she was in another wing of the building. Audio recordings of Tao placing orders for the neurotoxin. Financial transfers to accounts belonging to 3 men who had been feeding the operative's reports from inside the compound. The room watched in silence. When the footage ended, Elder Ha sat back. Her expression had not changed. An elder to her left, A man Adaeze didn't know, whose name Jae-min had told her was Elder Yun, and who had been the most vocally supportive of Teo during the succession murmurs, had gone very still in a way that was its own kind of answer. The evidence against Teo, Elder Ha said carefully, is compelling. A tribunal will be convened.
She paused.
But I want to address the matter of the woman. Her name, Jae-min said, is Adaeze Okonkwo. I know her name. Elder Ha looked at Adaeze directly, not dismissively, but with the assessing attention of someone who had spent decades deciding which things were worth her time. What I want to know is what she represents to you, and what she represents to us. Jae-min reached over and took Adaeze's hand. Bare skin on bare skin, his fingers interlaced with hers, placed flat on the table between them where everyone in the room could see it. Several of the elders shifted. One of the older men made a sound in the back of his throat. The significance was not lost on anyone in the room. This was a man who had not willingly made physical contact with another human being in 11 years, doing so in front of the syndicate's leadership council with the deliberateness of someone making a statement. For over a decade, Jae-min said, I could not shake a hand without experiencing neurological pains so severe it incapacitated me. My condition has been documented by physicians in Korea, Switzerland, and the United States. It has never been treatable and has never improved. He paused. She is the only person alive whose contact does not trigger it. The only person in 11 years who has been able to stand beside me without making every moment more difficult to survive. He looked at the council. She saved my life during a medical crisis that would have been fatal without intervention. She endured 3 days of wrongful imprisonment without breaking or informing against me to the people who put her there. And tonight, she shielded me from a sonic weapon using her own body. His jaw was set. She is not a vulnerability. She is the most precise and reliable form of stability I have ever had access to. And I will not be asked to frame her as a liability to this council. Elder Yun leaned forward. With respect, CEO Kang. I'm not finished. Jae-min's voice did not raise. It simply did not leave room for interruption. I am telling you who she is. I am telling you what she means to this family's leadership going forward. And I am telling you that any action taken against her is an action taken against me. He looked at Elder Ha. I don't take threats against myself well. This council has known that for 11 years. I trust we do not need to revisit it. The room was quiet for a long moment. Elder Ha looked at Adaeze. You understand what this world is, she said. It was not a question. What it requires. What it costs. Adaeze held the older woman's gaze. I come from a neighborhood in Lagos where the people I loved most had to fight for everything they had and still came up short. I have been calculating costs my entire life.
She paused.
I'm not here because I stumbled into this. I'm here because I chose to stay when every sensible calculation said I should leave. That's the only answer I have. Elder Ha studied her for several seconds. Then she turned to the rest of the council. The tribunal for Teo will convene within the week, she said. This council acknowledges Miss Okonkwo as being under CEO Kang's personal protection. Any member of this body who acts against her acts against the family and will be treated accordingly. She looked at Jae-min. Don't give us a reason to revisit this conversation. He nodded once. They left the council room together, and Jae-min did not release her hand until they were in the corridor with the doors closed behind them. The tribunal took 4 days. The evidence was not contested. Teo's defense consisted largely of denials that became less convincing with each piece of documentation presented against them, and eventually devolved into a silence that the council interpreted correctly. His title was formally stripped. His assets within the Cheongya structure were seized and redistributed. He was exiled to a monitored property in rural South Korea, comfortable enough to not constitute cruelty, isolated enough to not constitute anything else. He would live out the remainder of his days in a house with views and no influence, which was, for a man built like Teo, a more complete punishment than any cell would have been. Exile was the right call, Jae-min told Adaeze the night it was announced. Power is the only thing Teo has ever needed to survive. Take that away, and whatever remains isn't worth the cost of punishing it. She sat beside him in his quarters, their shoulders touching, and thought about her mother in Lagos counting inventory under fluorescent pharmacy lights, and about Emeka, whose right hand had recovered more mobility in the past month than in the entire year before it. The result of a specialist Jae-min had identified and arranged and paid for without ceremony, as though the action required no particular acknowledgement. She thought about the folder of medical bills that had lived under her bed back home, organized by due date, and which no longer existed in that form. She thought about the night of the storm, about the floor of a dark corridor and a man whose body had been turned against him and who had held onto her wrist like it was the only solid ground left. She thought about the fact that she had stayed, that she had, when given every reason to walk out the service entrance and back toward an airport, not walked. Good things, she had learned from her mother, rarely announce themselves. They tend to arrive in the shape of something difficult and reveal what they are over time. The months between the tribunal and the wedding were not quiet ones. The Cheongya Syndicate required stabilizing after everything Teo had set in motion. There were alliances that had been tilted by his positioning, associates who had been hedging their loyalty with the assumption of a succession, financial arrangements that needed to be unraveled and rebuilt. Jae-min handled all of it with the same cold precision that had built the empire in the first place, and Adaeze watched him do it from close enough to see the difference. The difference was this. Before, the work had been the only thing. It had been survival dressed as ambition, endurance dressed as strategy. Now it was still work, still demanding and relentless and occasionally brutal, but it sat differently on him. Like something he was doing rather than something he was inside of. He was sleeping. That was the most visible change, and the one that mattered most to her. Not always, but regularly. The nightmares that had made him wake at 3 a.m. and stand at the eastern window until dawn came with decreasing frequency, and when they came she would feel him still beside her and put her hand on his back, and that was usually enough. The quiet worked in both directions. She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. Not the compound, not the man, not the particular quality of the life that had assembled itself around her since the night of the storm. She had come to Vermont with a folder of medical bills and a calculation. She had stayed because walking away had started to feel like a kind of self-betrayal she wasn't willing to commit. Emeka called every Sunday. Her mother called every Tuesday and Thursday, which was the same frequency she had always called, adjusted for the time difference. The conversations had changed. Her mother no longer asked whether she was eating enough, or sleeping in a safe place, or being careful with the money, but they had not changed in the way that mattered. They were still the same three people in a constellation that had been oriented around each other since the day Adaeze was old enough to understand what a family was. Jae-min had learned that her mother's name was Mom Nkechi, and that this was what you called her, and he had done so the first time she called, and Adaeze handed him the phone because she thought it would be funny and was not prepared for how not funny it actually turned out to be, how her mother had spoken to him for 20 minutes in a mixture of English and Yoruba, and how Jae-min had apparently understood more of the second than expected, and how when Adaeze had taken the phone back, her mother had said in Yoruba that the man sounded serious, and that serious was what you prayed for. A year later, the compound in Vermont was a different building. Not literally. The glass walls and polished steel were unchanged. The east wing still carried the particular hush of a space designed for concentration and quiet. But the quality of the silence had shifted. It was not the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of something inhabited, something chosen, something that had settled into itself. The guest wing, where Teo had spent his last 3 weeks before exile, had been renovated. It was Adaeze's idea. She suggested it carefully, expecting resistance, and Jae-min had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Yes. Good." And that had been the full extent of the conversation. The room became a study, lined with books she could read, which she was working through at a speed that satisfied her. She had enrolled in a business management program online. Jae-min had observed this without comment, which she had come to recognize as his version of deep approval. Emeka visited in the spring. He arrived with their mother, who had been brought over for a specialist appointment in Boston and then stayed, because Jae-min had prepared a guest room for both of them without being asked, and because Adaeze's mother, a woman who had assessed risk with the precision of someone who had survived on thin margins her entire life, had taken one look at the compound and one longer look at the man in it and said, in Yoruba, "He is serious," which was the highest thing she said about anyone. Emeka and Jae-min played chess for 3 hours the first afternoon. Emeka won 2 out of 3 games, which Adaeze noted with considerable satisfaction. Jae-min noted it with something that looked like respect. The wedding was held in autumn, when the Vermont trees had turned the colors that made the mountains look like they were on fire. It was not a large event by syndicate standards. Jae-min had wanted it contained family, the most trusted inner circle, a few of the elders who had earned their presence. Adaeze's mother sat in the front row in emerald green and did not cry until Adaeze walked in, and then cried for the entire ceremony, which she would later deny completely. Emeka was beside her, and the look on his face when Adaeze passed him was one she would carry for the rest of her life. A brother looking at his sister and seeing that she had found something worth the risk of everything. Jae-min was waiting at the end of the aisle in all black, as always, and his gloves were not there. His bare hands were clasped in front of him. He didn't move as she approached. He didn't need to. The man who had once enforced a 3-foot perimeter around himself as a matter of survival stood still and let her walk to him, and when she arrived, he took both her hands in his and held them with the steady, unhurried grip of a man who had learned to stop bracing for pain. The ceremony incorporated traditional elements from both families, a Korean paybeak ritual before the formal vows, presided over by an elder Jae-min had known since childhood, and a Yoruba blessing spoken by Adaeze's mother in a voice that required no microphone. When the time came for the vows, Jae-min spoke without notes. "I spent 11 years being certain that the most I could expect from the rest of my life was to survive it," he said. "You changed what I thought surviving meant. You made me understand that there is a difference between enduring and living, and you are the reason I know which one this is." He paused. His jaw was working. He was not a man who cried easily. She suspected he had cried very little in the past decade, that the habit had been trained out of him in a white room in Incheon, but his eyes were bright. "I am better because of you. Quieter, more human. And I intend to spend the rest of my life being worth the choice you made when you stayed." Adaeze's voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "I came here to do a job," she said. "I stayed because something in you recognized something in me, and I was not willing to walk away from that recognition just because it was difficult." She looked at him, really looked, the way she had learned to look since the beginning, past the mask and the gloves and the 11 years of careful armor to the man who had asked her, in a darkened corridor during a storm, not to let go. "You are not what happened to you. You never were. And I will spend whatever time I have reminding you of that." She paused. "Even when you're catastrophically wrong." There was laughter in the small room, even from Elder Ha, which Woo Jin would later describe as the most surprising thing he had witnessed in 30 years of service. They were pronounced married, and he kissed her with the same careful gentleness that had marked the first time, like something precious being handled by hands that had learned only recently that precious things could be touched. The reception moved into the ballroom, the same space where Teoa's sonic weapon had been deployed and where Adaeze had run across a room full of falling people to wrap herself around a man who needed her more than he had ever needed anything. The room had no memory of that now, or if it did, the memory was buried under music and voices and the particular warmth of a space full of people who had chosen to be there. Jae-min was waiting at the end of the aisle in all black, as always, and his gloves were not there. His bare hands were clasped in front of him. He didn't move as she approached. He didn't need to. The man who had once enforced a 3-foot perimeter around himself as a matter of survival stood still and let her walk to him, and when she arrived, he took both her hands in his and held them with the steady, unhurried grip of a man who had learned to stop bracing for pain. The ceremony incorporated traditional elements from both families, a Korean paybeak ritual before the formal vows, presided over by an elder Jae-min had known since childhood, and a Yoruba blessing spoken by Adaeze's mother in a voice that required no microphone. When the time came for the vows, Jae-min spoke without notes. "I spent 11 years being certain that the most I could expect from the rest of my life was to survive it," he said. "You changed what I thought surviving meant. You made me understand that there is a difference between enduring and living, and you are the reason I know which one this is." He paused. His jaw was working. He was not a man who cried easily. She suspected he had cried very little in the past decade, that the habit had been trained out of him in a white room in Incheon, but his eyes were bright. I am better because of you. Quieter. More human. And I intend to spend the rest of my life being worth the choice you made when you stayed. Adaeze's voice was steadier than she expected it to be. I came here to do a job, she said. I stayed because something in you recognized something in me, and I was not willing to walk away from that recognition just because it was difficult. She looked at him. Really looked, the way she had learned to look since the beginning, past the mask and the gloves and the 11 years of careful armor to the man who had asked her, in a darkened corridor during a storm, not to let go. You are not what happened to you. You never were. And I will spend whatever time I have reminding you of that.
She paused.
Even when you're catastrophically wrong. There was laughter in the small room. Even from Elder Ha, which Wu Jin would later describe as the most surprising thing he had witnessed in 30 years of service. They were pronounced married, and he kissed her with the same careful gentleness that had marked the first time, like something precious being handled by hands that had learned only recently that precious things could be touched. The reception moved into the ballroom, the same space where Teoa's sonic weapon had been deployed and where Adaeze had run across a room full of falling people to wrap herself around a man who needed her more than he had ever needed anything. The room had no memory of that now, or if it did, the memory was buried under music and voices and the particular warmth of a space full of people who had chosen to be there. Jae-min danced badly. This was something Adaeze had not anticipated, and she found it, genuinely, the most charming thing about him. He moved with all the precision of a man accustomed to controlling his body and none of the instinct for rhythm that made dancing look natural, and he was clearly aware of this, and continued anyway, his bare hand warm at the small of her back, his other hand holding hers, his face wearing an expression of concentrated effort that made her laugh. You're terrible at this, she told him. I know. He turned them in a small, careful circle. I'm choosing not to care. That's very unlike you. You're having that effect on me. Later, in the quiet of their quarters, he removed her dress with the same reverence he brought to everything he considered worth his full attention, slowly, carefully, like a man who understood that some things were worth doing slowly. She turned to face him and undid the buttons of his jacket, and they stood together in the low light without armor, without performance, without the particular exhaustion of people who are presenting a version of themselves rather than the thing itself. I still find it hard to believe sometimes, he said, his hands at her waist, his forehead against hers. That you're real. That this is real.
Test it, she said.
He kissed her. Long and deliberate and quiet, the way the compound was quiet now. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something full, something that had settled into its own weight. They came together that night with the particular tenderness of people who have survived something together and know it, who have earned the ease of each other through difficulty rather than arrived at it through luck. He held her afterward in the charcoal silk sheets, his arm around her waist, her back against his chest, their breathing finding the same rhythm in the dark. Outside, the Vermont autumn had given way to early winter. The first snow was moving in. Adaeze could feel it in the cold that pressed against the glass, and in the morning the mountains would be white, and the compound would sit inside a silence that was weather-made and clean. She thought about Surelair, about the fabric stall and the rotating fund and the two-bedroom apartment where the power cut out on a schedule everyone had learned to plan around, about the folder organized by due date that no longer existed, about the version of herself that had read a job listing and decided that what other people called dangerous was simply a situation she hadn't assessed yet. She thought about the storm, about her palm on a man's forehead and the word he had said afterward, barely audible, barely believing itself, silence. That was how it had started, with the absence of pain in a place where pain had been the only thing for 11 years. What are you thinking about? He asked. His voice was low and almost asleep. The beginning, she said. He pressed his lips to her shoulder. Which part? She considered. The part where you told me not to pity you. A quiet sound from him, not quite a laugh. And did you?
No.
She found his hand in the dark and held it. I just thought you deserved to be told the truth. Which was that it sounded like hell.
She paused.
And that you didn't have to stay in it. He was quiet for a moment. His hand tightened around hers. You were right, he said. They fell asleep like that, her hand in his, the snow beginning outside, the mountains going white in the dark. The compound that had been a fortress and a cage was a home now, imperfect, complicated, carrying the weight of everything that had happened inside its walls, but warm in the way that places become warm when they are truly inhabited. Kang Jae-min, the iron veil of the Cheongya, the man the underworld had called untouchable for 11 years, slept without nightmares. In the morning, they would wake and face the day as they had agreed to face everything that came after, together. The syndicate would demand things. The elders would require management. The world they lived in would continue to be the world it was, complicated and costly, and rarely fair. But none of that was new. They had both known, since before they were willing to name it, that this was the shape of the choice. Difficult, real, and worth every calculation it required. Adaeze Okonkwo had come to Vermont to do a job. She had stayed to do something much harder and much more important. She had stayed to tell a man who had been living in hell that he deserved to leave it. And she had been right. That's the end of the story. If this one stayed with you, if Adaeze and Jae-min are still in your chest right now, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Velvet Tales, leave a comment below, share this with one person who needs a love story tonight. Every single one of you makes this possible, and I am grateful for every pair of ears in this community. Until the next one.